Real estate words and terms with meanings and examples, part number 18. Mortgagee, which means the lender who provides the loan secured by a mortgage. For example, the mortgagee approved the home loan for the buyer. This means the lender agreed to give the buyer money to purchase the property. Mortgager, which means the borrower who takes out a mortgage to buy property. For instance, the mortgager made monthly payments to the bank. This implies the borrower paid the lender every month. Net lease, which means a lease where the tenant pays base rent plus some or all property expenses. For example, in a net lease, the tenant covered property taxes in addition to rent. This means the tenant paid both rent and taxes. Net present value, NPV, which means the current value of future cash flows minus the initial investment cost. For instance, the developer calculated the NPV before buying the land. This implies they checked if future profits would be worth the cost. Net proceeds, which means the amount a seller gets after all selling costs are deducted. For example, after closing costs, the net proceeds from the sale were $200,000. This means the seller kept $200,000 after expenses. Net worth, which means total assets minus total liabilities. For instance, buying the property increased the investor's net worth. This implies the investor's wealth grew after the purchase. NOI, net operating income, which means income from a property after operating expenses, but before taxes and financing costs. For example, the apartment complex generated an NOI of $500,000 last year. This means it earned $500,000 after paying for maintenance and management. Nominal rate, which means the stated interest rate before adjusting for inflation or compounding. For instance, the loan had a nominal rate of 6% per year. This implies the rate did not account for other financial effects. Non-conforming loan, which means a loan that doesn't meet Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac standards. For example, the high-priced home required a non-conforming loan. This means the loan amount exceeded standard limits. Non-disturbance agreement, which means a deal ensuring tenants can stay if the property's ownership changes. For instance, the tenant signed a non-disturbance agreement with the lender. This implies the tenant's lease would be honored after foreclosure. Notarize, which means to have a document verified by a notary public. For example, the buyer had to notarize the deed before closing. This means a notary confirmed their identity and signature. Notice of default, which means a formal notice that a borrower has failed to meet mortgage terms. For instance, the bank issued a notice of default after missed payments. This implies foreclosure proceedings could begin. Offer, which means a proposal to buy property at specific terms and price. For example, the buyer submitted an offer for $350,000. This means they proposed to purchase at that amount. Off-market, which means a property not publicly listed for sale. For instance, they bought the house through an off-market deal. This implies the property was sold privately. Open house, which means a scheduled time for potential buyers to view a property. For example, the agent hosted an open house on Sunday afternoon. This means visitors could tour the home without appointments. Open listing, which means a non-exclusive agreement allowing multiple agents to try selling a property. For instance, the seller chose an open listing to attract more buyers. This implies they worked with several agents at once. Option period, which means a set time when a buyer can cancel a contract without penalty. For example, the buyer backed out during the option period. This means they canceled within the allowed time frame. Ordinance, which means a local law regulating property use. For instance, the city ordinance prohibited building over 3 stories. This implies the law set height restrictions. Origination fee, which means a charge from the lender for processing a new loan. For example, the mortgage had a 1% origination fee. This means the borrower paid 1% of the loan amount up front. Owner's title policy, which means insurance protecting the buyer from title defects. For instance, the buyer purchased an owner's title policy for peace of mind. This implies protection against ownership disputes. Ownership in severalty, which means sole ownership of property by one person or entity. For example, she held the property in ownership in severalty. This means she was the only owner. Parcel, which means a defined piece of land. For instance, the farmer sold a parcel to a developer. This implies they sold a section of their land. Partial interest, which means ownership of only part of a property. For example, he inherited a partial interest in the family home. This means he co-owned the property with others. Partition, which means the legal division of property among owners. For instance, the siblings filed for partition of their inherited land. This implies they wanted the property split between them. Payoff amount, which means the total sum needed to fully pay off a loan. For example, the payoff amount on the mortgage was $150,000. This means that's what the borrower needed to settle the debt.